Hello, everyone. Welcome to Paraversal Universe on the Inception Radio Network. Brought to you by the Northern Wisconsin Paranormal Society Limited and the Northwoods Paranormal Resource Center here in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. We're your hosts, Kevin and Jennifer Malek.
Hello, everybody.
And hello to everybody in the IRN chat room. We look forward to your questions and comments as always. IRNchat.com is the link to the chat room, so come join us there. And before we bring tonight's guest out, we're going to do shout-outs. Shout-outs go to those folks who share our banner, or show banners every week. We appreciate it very much. Who do we have for this week?
We have Walter Brooks, Thoughts of Christos, Jason Bland, Jamie Demelos, Paranormal Soup, Shannon Glisson, Zulma Falcon Matos, Ken and Farrah Rose Deal, Demonology Today Radio, Debbie Grashberger Schmoll, Grins Paranormal, and Dawn and Brent Elmer.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing our banners, and thanks, everybody, our regular chat crew, and those that come in the chat. It's always good to see you there. Tonight, we're going to cover a topic that, believe it or not, we haven't delved into before in the years we've been on Paraversal Universe, and that would be serial killers. And tonight, we're going to discuss two famous serial killers in history, H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper, who may actually be one and the same person. Now, with us tonight is the great-great-grandson of H.H. Holmes, Mr. Jeff Mudgett, author of the book Bloodstains, which Jennifer just finished reading. And he's the star of the TV show American Ripper. Now, Jennifer and myself attended the Chicago Ghost Conference last October, and we had the chance to meet Jeff in person and listen to his lecture regarding the mystery, which was quite well done and very interesting. So much so that Jennifer asked Jeff to spend an hour with us tonight so we can explore this mystery with our audience. And, of course, Jeff graciously said yes. So without further ado, let's bring Jeff on. Jeff, are you with us?
Kevin, Jennifer, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on Paraversal Universe Radio with you tonight.
And thank you for being on. We've been looking forward to this ever since you said yes.
Yeah. It's I enjoy shows like yours. I enjoy answering the questions from you and your audience, and I'm looking forward to new material, new questions to ask that may be quite often when I go on shows like this. We come up with new material because of great ideas from the hosts and the audience, so I'm always excited about doing them.
That's awesome.
That's great.
Yeah, I know you've done many podcasts, so I hope that we can throw some good stuff your way. And, you know, there's so much to the amazing story. And, of course, we only have an hour. So why don't we start with the book Bloodstains? When did you first decide to write the book, and what was the catalyst or initial motivation behind it?
You know, I would imagine the initial motivation was 20 years ago when my grandfather revealed to the family that he carried this horrible burden with him alone his entire life. He hadn't even told my grandmother that our ancestor was perhaps the most evil man in American history, and that he expected all of us to help us with that burden now. And in particular, he was considering me. And I was a practicing California lawyer at the time, had dealt with criminal cases, knew the ramifications of what were involved with the statute of limitations and cold capital cases. I began to do research regarding this horrible man who was my roots, who was my origins. And before I knew it, Jennifer, I had an obsession which pretty much caused me to set my career aside to determine what was true and what was false in this legend about this man that that they created the phrase serial killer for, and also psychopathic. So as my research grew deeper and deeper, instead of answering the questions that I initially had, they kept growing like you were planting seeds in a field. And still to this day, as I talk to you and Kevin in Chicago, new material continues to come up, and which I need to do more and more work, and it's help from you and hosts like you and Kevin that helped me get through some of the new questions coming out. So I don't quite know how to describe exactly, if a reader wants to pick up my book and see and step into my shoes, to have their grandfather tell them that, their origins were this evil being. But that's what I tried to do when I wrote the book. Instead of just another book about H.H. Holmes, which there are hundreds of, I wanted this one to be more personal. I wanted it to be more about my journey and how that knowledge changed my entire life.
One of the things I remember early from the show was it the tackle box and the secret compartment. Now, did that stuff come along before the book and before the show?
Oh yeah, a long time before. That was my grandfather left me to those when he passed away. As I describe in the book, Jennifer, you can jump in and help me if you'd like, but my father delivered me those tackle boxes one day out of the blue. I pretty much set them aside, not very much interested in them for personal reasons, as I also tried to explain in the book. My grandfather was this very cold, stoic personality who had not shown any love to me my entire life. As a matter of fact, he was a man who would go fishing almost every weekend, and when I was a little boy, I lived to fish. And imagine, Kevin, your grandfather never inviting you to go fishing with him when he knew you were waiting, with bated breath every time he walked by for that invite. And as you can imagine, I didn't have any love for the man. And when my father, brought those tackle boxes to me, I didn't show any sympathy at all. I pretty much stuffed them into the corner of a garage, and they sat there for quite a period of time until one day I went out and rummaged through his artifacts, his fishing gear, and then, found the material that pretty much makes up the cornerstone for the book Bloodstains.
So how did television get involved?
Have either of you watched my TED Talk that I gave in Vancouver about the Holmes connection to Jack the Ripper?
No, not yet.
Okay, it's on YouTube. If any of your listeners would like to go there, if they Google up TED Talk and H.H. Holmes, Jack the Ripper, they'll see me giving a talk to 3,000 or 4,000 people. And it went quite well. History watched my talk and fell in love with the connections I was making based on the evidence I presented, and contacted me regarding possibly producing a show with them, about that same connection, whether H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. And I imagine we negotiated for almost a year, and then production was almost another year. So as TV is, it was quite a period of time before that first episode came out on American Ripper.
So I guess at this point we can either go, well, why don't we start with Holmes? When did he first kill? When did he first start killing people?
That's a subject that's still open to debate, Kevin. I've never seen any direct evidence regarding his first murder. I have my theories. I know history presented evidence. I think my co-host Amaryllis Fox worked that scene mostly. It was, they believe, when he was a young boy living in Gilmington, New Hampshire, there were some townspeople that had long researched that evidence that the murder of his cousin had occurred behind their house in a small creek. And we actually ran that down, I think, as best we could, like I say, without coming up with direct evidence as in fingerprints or blood types or weapons, things like that. But I don't think it's that much of a stretch to tie those pieces of coincidence together in circumstantial evidence to state that it's probably true that he killed at a young age.
Yeah, and like you say, like even though a lot of that stuff was circumstantial evidence, it's still evidence. I mean, you have physical evidence, and you have documentary evidence, and you have circumstantial evidence, and even without the I guess what would you call it, the smoking gun of the physical evidence, you can still put a puzzle together, with if you have enough documentary evidence and enough circumstantial evidence to put that puzzle together and see enough of it to, read the writing on the wall, so to speak.
Right. But what's tricky about back then, too, is when you had a lot of the stuff that would have happened, like, for instance, with the family member that he just mentioned, that was the cousin. Around that time, people didn't keep enough accurate records.
Right. And they said that there was, like all the deaths, for instance, weren't reported.
Yeah, right.
So, I mean, they only know some. And for a town of that small size, in that part of American history, to have so many unsolved deaths so close to young Mr. Holmes, I thought was pretty uncanny myself.
No, I think you're both right on the money. And when we were doing our research regarding Ripper-esque style killings in Chicago using the archives from the city with, detectives, trained detectives, over and over again, we came across people that the police had simply listed as missing, despite having had relationships or contact with H.H. Holmes. And that's what we continued to find during the production of the show and our investigation, was that, we have, the records are tough, the history is old, and then we're dealing with probably the most skilled of manipulators at eliminating evidence in human remains after a murder that maybe mankind has ever experienced. That's what Holmes was. The man was a doctor, he was a chemist, he was a pharmacist. He knew how to eliminate evidence and create alibis, putting him somewhere other than a murder scene. And when you run up against that type of intellect, and he was an incredible intellect, an evil genius, with the training to eliminate the evidence police and history needs to conclusively prove a murder, not just hundreds. That's what we ran up against time and time again, and which still causes debate today among historians pertaining to how many people Holmes actually murdered.
Yeah, because
New York & Company is the best kept secret for great fashion at amazing prices. The new holiday collection has arrived, and this weekend is the Friends and Family sale. Every single thing 50% off. From holiday party outfits that sparkle to hundreds of spectacular gifts starting at $5. They have something for everyone, including new arrivals from their exclusive celebrity brands from Eva Mendes and Gabrielle Union. Hurry and check out the best deals of the year from New York & Company.
I mean, if you look at the way he was from a young age, from what I remember from reading the book, is he started experimenting and studying the anatomy of corpses at a very young age.
Oh, when other boys were out hunting deer, he was working with a physician with cadavers. That's his fascination started very, very young.
So as he grown up, it's possible he murdered people. Then he became a doctor, right? And I remember watching the show. If I remember right, he had bought the property for the murder castle, right? But it wasn't completely built until he returned from London. Is that correct?
Well, the Whitechapel murders occurred in 1888, and as best we could determine, I think the property for the murder castle was built the summer before those murders, and construction started the year after, because there was a horrible winter that year when he returned from London, and I would have imagined construction would have been impossible during that time. And I know it went on for a period of a year or two before the building was in operation, which he had always believed was the perfect factory for death to have when the exposition came to Chicago, the World's Fair, because we're talking about his little hotel with basement 2 miles down the railway line from maybe the biggest gathering of human beings in the history of man. I mean, there were 20 million people there. You had so many people there. The Chicago police were overrun. They couldn't keep track of the number of crimes, of the number of missing people, of the number of murders. And Holmes knew that was coming to his backyard, and he prepared for it with perhaps the most, well, I don't want to say famous, but infamous building for premeditated murder that, you know, a man like him had maybe ever thought of, engineered, and finally created. I call him the American Frankenstein, and I try to have people understand that concept when they want to believe or understand what Holmes really was.
Yeah, because I noticed too, like the time period that he abruptly left Chicago and the Ripper killings happened, as you just stated. What was interesting to me was they had the ship's manifest log of passengers. Like, I couldn't believe how many aliases he used.
You know, and that was...
And it was funny.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Well, go ahead.
No, that was... I'm sorry again. That was one of the most amazing parts of the show for me, and those were the creative people at History working with Amaryllis Fox, my co-host. She took over that scene regarding the passenger lists and trying to nail down Holmes's either his signature or his alibi on those lists going from New York to London. And in my opinion, they did a great job doing that, because that's a question that had plagued me for years whenever I went on shows like yours or, you know, the other television shows that I've done. I was always asked, can you show Holmes's name on a passenger list from a ship from London to New York? And, you know, while I would continually argue with those historians demanding that evidence, say, here's a man that had 31 different aliases. He was the master of alibis. He had lawyers, he had notaries that could place him incorrectly anywhere in the country when he needed to be somewhere else. So when History and Amaryllis came up with those names on that passenger list, I knew they'd struck gold. That was amazing evidence.
Well, I think one of the obvious aliases that was pointed out was the fact that he used Holmes.
Yeah, he actually used, even though he had all the aliases, he even used
Holmes.
Well, which was probably his most famous alias, right? Because even Holmes was an alias, correct?
No, that was the name he selected. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett.
Okay, right.
So I have a question for you from the chat room.
All right.
Are you aware of the psychologist James Fallon? He is a scientist who studies psychopathy and found out he is related to the Lizzie Borden family. This led to interesting scientific insights. The follow-up question, is there a family history that ties into Holmes's personality?
My answer to the first question is no. I'm not aware of a Dr. Fallon. I'd certainly like to read some of his work regarding Lizzie Borden. There are many historians who contact me quite often regarding a potential connection between Holmes and her. I've never studied it or tried to research it diligently, so that would interest me greatly if that member of your chat room wants to provide me with that information. As far as the second question, Holmes's mother and father were fine American citizens. His descendants, as far as my grandfather, my father, none of us were ever even convicted for jaywalking, let alone murder. And if you go back far enough along the Mudgett line, you come up to heroes of the American Revolution, which history actually did a story about once about the Mudgetts back then. So, no, the answer to that question is Holmes. And quite frankly, I'm proud of that fact. I think much of medical science has been made about the passing on of evil genes. And I think my family is the living example of why that's not true. This brilliant man, who could have been a Louis Pasteur, in my opinion, decided that he liked money and women more than the notoriety his intellect could have given him solving or curing cancer, say. And that selection on his part is the choice that we all have when we live on Earth and decide what we want to do with our lives.
So, of all the stuff that was looked at while you guys were in London, and or anything that to come since, what do you think is the most compelling evidence that Jack the Ripper is H.H. Holmes? Out of all this stuff, because there's a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, there's actually a lot. I mean, the amount of circumstantial evidence is crazy. I mean, it's really that much. People don't realize how much there is. I mean, just all these little ties and this and that and. Can you let us know?
And before I'd love to answer your question, but before I do, I'd like to let you all know, in my opinion, this mystery solved. This case is closed. This is what I did for a living. H.H. Holmes is Jack the Ripper. If he was alive today, I could assist English prosecutors in having a warrant for his arrest issued. I could get an order for extradition across the Atlantic, and he would have to stand trial for the murders of Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride. And that, to me, there's no doubt of. And I've issued that challenge to, historians around the world, especially London, that I'll stand up on stage with any of them if they want to put one of their suspects up against Holmes, and we'll compare them bullet point by bullet point, evidence by evidence, and none of them will even come close to Holmes. So I don't want you to think that's what I believe or my theory. I know I've solved this case. Now, as far as your question goes, and you've got to give me a little bit of leeway on this, this would be a murder trial, all right? We're talking days for a prosecution to prove his case. It's not done in a period of minutes. So when, I try to go through the mountain of circumstantial evidence that we have tying Holmes to the Ripper murders, the handwriting analysis, the opinions of the experts in London stating that the Dear Boss letter had been written by an American trying to sound English, the eyewitness testimonies, the profiles that have been put together by professionals, forensic scientists establishing a similarity of identity and appearance. I like the evidence when Scotland Yard followed Holmes back across the Atlantic to research Ripper-esque style killings in New York City. And then perhaps the most amazing evidence to me of all, besides the passenger list that Jennifer mentioned earlier, are the Ripper murders in Chicago when Holmes was there, and how they abruptly stop and start up again when you put them around the timeline of the Whitechapel murders. That, to me, is an amazing piece of evidence.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Vice versa.
I think one of the most things that shocked me when we were watching this whole entire series was when you guys had went to a home where people had personal items that belonged to Holmes, and in one of the boxes pulls out a photo of one of the Ripper victims. That
was a couple of friends of mine from Irvington, Indiana, and I'll explain to you how that went, because that I left that out when I was answering Kevin's question about what struck me the most, because we were in a room in Indiana. We had the film crew around Amaryllis and I, audio teams around us, and then Alan and Tricia Hunt came in with their box of artifacts, and I had never seen them before. And the filming was on, all right? So the box was opened up. The director wanted our accurate, looks on our faces as we saw this evidence. And they started explaining to us the knives, Holmes's knives that he had bought in London. And then original photographs of some of his assistants, like Pat Quinlan. And then, lo and behold, there's a small tintype, and Amaryllis grabs it and says, "That looks very, very familiar." Hands it to me, and I say, "That looks like Elizabeth Stride, one of the Ripper victims." So Amaryllis grabbed it back, and we proceeded to take it to a professional profiler who studied the tintype as well as he could. It's a very small picture. And he came up with a very high number, and that's how they do their business. They come up with a number regarding similarities. He came up with a very high number establishing that the tintype probably was Elizabeth Stride, one of the Ripper victims, and had been in Holmes's possession.
Wow.
Right. Wow.
And I just wanted to say the reason I ask these questions is so that the people listening can hear just how much is out there, because personally, I believe that Holmes was Jack the Ripper.
Oh, totally. There's no question about it.
I mean, you can only deny evidence, so much evidence. But when go ahead.
Sorry, I apologize.
No, I apologize. I didn't mean to cut you off. I just
no, and I wanted to tell you, and what most people, for your listeners, they don't understand, and I hope they appreciate, is that no author has ever had their work scrutinized at the level I have. I had History Channel with their teams of experts going over every piece of evidence supporting my theory with a magnifying glass and a fine-tooth comb. This was history's reputation at stake. Had they found anything that was false, misleading, or didn't work or carry the theory, they would have closed the show down. And no other author has had that level of scrutiny. And I'm quite proud that the show went on for 8 episodes and, was put out over the entire country. And that last episode that we all watched set records for viewership.
Awesome.
Wow.
And the story keeps going, too.
Yeah.
So we're just about to that point.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's time for our first commercial break. You are listening to Paraversal Universe on the Inception Radio Network. We will be right back.
Welcome back to Paraversal Universe on the Inception Radio Network. We're your hosts, Kevin and Jennifer Malek, and we are talking to Jeff Mudgett about H.H. Holmes and Jack the Ripper and his book Bloodstains. But before we bring him back on, we'd like to take a minute to thank everybody who makes Paraversal Universe possible, including graphics art designer Lawrence D. Miza, webmaster Joe Champion, music by Matt Stens, producer Mike M.J. Lucas, And of course,
New York & Company is the best kept secret for great fashion at amazing prices. The new holiday collection has arrived, and this weekend is the Friends and Family Sale. Every single thing 50% off. From holiday party outfits that sparkle to hundreds of spectacular gifts starting at $5. They have something for everyone, including new arrivals from their exclusive celebrity brands from Eva Mendes and Gabrielle Union. Hurry and check out the best deals of the year from New York & Company.
to God for granting us this wonderful show and opportunity here to be with you all. This segment is brought to you by Lucas Wellness, the UFO Wisconsin Research Team, and the book Trail of the Sasquatch, The Shaman's Journey. We also have 3 Paraversal Universe like pages we're checking out. And of course, Jennifer's like page, Jennifer Malek, Scientific Demonologist. And of course, the Northern Wisconsin Paranormal Society Limited like page. We also have 2 group pages worth noting: Lake Monstrosities, which is the largest group page on Facebook for aquatic mysteries, and Ultimate Conspiracies, which is pretty much self-explanatory. If you have any questions for our guests, go to ironchat.com and go to our live Iron Chat room, where you can post your questions and make comments, and Jennifer will pass those along. Okay, back to the show.
Yeah.
Jeff, you still with us?
I'm here.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, okay, here we are. Now that we're back for the second part, I figured one of the things I wanted to talk about for a little bit was the whole trial of H.H. Holmes. He had, when we left off, we had, actually, you know what, why don't we, well, yeah, we had the murder castle.
Right. We had the murder castle, yes.
And you know what I remember I wanted to discuss before the hangings was the women in Holmes' life that lived with him at the murder castle. Because he had different mistresses and wives, correct? And you'd figure some of them, at least, would have been in on what he's got going on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
No, I think you've hit on one of the great untold portions of the story. History and many authors have written that these were innocent young women who were duped by the master manipulator. And in my opinion, that's totally false. Most of these women were very smart, very intelligent. They knew what Holmes was. They knew who he was. They also knew he had women on the side of them, and they still stuck with him, even going so far as to help him with his cons and frauds. And one of the disappointing parts about history deciding not to run the second season for me was the director and I had decided that second season would emphasize many of the wives and mistresses in Holmes's life and that part of the story, which, you know, if I write a sequel to Bloodstains, it's going to be about the women in his life.
That's interesting because we were, at some point, we're going to ask you about a second book. And yeah, that would be quite interesting.
Why don't we start off with the new information that he has?
Okay. We can jump to that. Which is...
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You know, it's one of the most fascinating portions of American Ripper to me was the exhumation at the end of the show when we had spent, you know, almost a year obtaining permission from my family, from the Catholic Church, from the courtrooms, the courthouse in Pennsylvania, from the judge allowing us to dig him up, from gathering maybe the greatest team of anthropologists, archaeologists, forensic scientists, you know, geological engineers ever put into one place for this dig, and then having it filmed by history, and then excuse me?
No, we didn't say anything.
No,
Continue.
we're listening. Continue.
Oh, okay. And then attempting to identify who it was we had exhumed, based on my theories that there was a chance that Holmes had escaped his own execution and switched a body into that particular grave and then gone on to commit further murders under another name. And I'd fascinated over that possibility for years. And when history told me they were going to help me with that, they were going to fund the enterprise, that was a dream come true. So when you and your viewers were watching that final episode, it pretty much emphasized that exhumation. And while we were under the gun as far as producing that final episode to be run in the time slot that history had allowed us, we didn't have the chance to carefully consider much of the evidence regarding who it really was. And over these last 2 or 3 weeks, I've come up with new evidence regarding identity, and I've been trying to put it on my Bloodstains Facebook page. That's what I asked you to look at, Jennifer, before the show.
Yes, and we did.
Oh, we did.
Yeah, and so when we discuss the exhumation, when the scientists would go through, we took a DNA extract from the skeletal remains. We measured the height of the skeleton based on Holmes's height while he was living. We examined the vertebra to determine if there was any trauma from, the violent hanging that a drop through the scaffolding would have been at the prison for an execution.
Right.
And then to compare the teeth from the skeleton with supposed records of Holmes's dental condition while he was alive. So you can see it's quite involved, and it involves a number of different scientists to come up with a conclusion. And at this point, I'm ready to state on your show that the DNA didn't match. There were no dental records of Holmes. The height of the skeleton was significantly less than Holmes when he was measured when he was alive, and there was no evidence of trauma to the neck. So under those circumstances and with that evidence, I can conclude now that the body we dug up and the remains we removed from that grave was not H.H. Holmes.
Now, that's compelling because when a body gets hung and it's dropped, the neck breaks.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a lot of weight that goes on. It only takes 6 pounds of 6 pounds of pressure to break a human bone. The body weighs how much? So when it comes down and it's all in the neck, there's going to be damage.
Yeah.
That alone. I mean, and then plus, like you said, the height difference.
The height difference.
Like, when I watched your lecture in Chicago, and you were talking about the trial, and could it have been possible for him to be swapped with someone else? Because there was a thing over his head when he was hung. And I had one question, and I don't know if anyone else has asked this of you, and it's something I kept coming back to, was there any evidence that Holmes was Masonic? Because if he was, then the escape would have been possible. Without that connection, however, it becomes much harder to fathom.
It's a great question you ask, and there are quite a few noted historians who have contacted me regarding Holmes's membership as a Mason, and the people that were involved in the alleged execution and burial who were also Masons. And I got to tell you, I'm not an expert on Masonic principles or their tactics. But the question, like I said, the question you raise is very interesting because it's not the first time it's come up about Holmes's membership in that group.
Well, Jennifer mentioned to me that the murder castle had a black and white checkered floor. And I'm a conspiracy analyst, and I study conspiracies. And so, to me, little things like that. Of course, anybody who doesn't know, Masonic temples usually have the black and white checkered floor, and the symbolism behind that is that 1 foot is in the light and 1 foot is in the dark, which is the neutrality belief when you're indoctrinated into the Masonic order. It's not all evil and it's not all good, and usually, that's a whole other topic amongst itself. But yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and that's something I wanted to ask you personally about. So yeah, that's because without that connection, I can't even see it happening. But you're talking about the most powerful men in the world, and they do take care of them, and money talks as well. And if I remember right, at the time, a prisoner could have wealth back then. So he had wealth, correct?
Wealth?
Wealth, yeah, money.
Holmes was rich while he was in prison. He was paid by the Hearst Corporation many thousands of dollars to write his memoirs awaiting his execution. And quite frankly, we were never able to establish what happened to that money, except that he probably used it to bribe or buy off the help he needed to pull off the fake execution.
Yeah, because I remember too, he was one of the only prisoners in the jail that actually had a desk, a chair, and an oil lamp, if I remember correctly.
You're exactly right. It was much when, obviously Moya Mensing prison has been torn down. That was the scene of the execution incarceration. So during American Ripper, we went to another old prison in the Philadelphia area, which had been turned into a museum and had a brilliant curator there that walked us through the tactics, techniques, and the procedures involved in incarceration at the time. And she was familiar with how special Holmes had been treated while he was in prison. As you say, he had a writing desk. He didn't even have his cell door was never closed. He got to wear his own clothes whenever he wanted to. He could have visitors. He could have reporters come in to interview him for talks. She said it was quite unusual.
Wow. And that speaks volumes. To me, anyways, I think that's quite interesting.
Can you run us through the trial of H.H. Holmes and what led up to his getting captured?
That's a question from chat.
Well, the theories are he was arrested in St. Louis for some fraud, and evidently, at least as far as the other authors and historians want to state, I've never quite believed this, to tell you the truth, but he talked too much to a cellmate who, for a deal regarding his own freedom, told the authorities what Holmes had said about a number of murders, who then followed Holmes across the country and eventually arrested him for the murder of Benjamin. Well, they arrested him for a life insurance fraud, and that charge was modified later for the murder of his partner, Benjamin Peitzel, which is what he stood trial for. And one of the amazing parts of the story was Holmes never actually stood trial for any of the murders he committed in Chicago.
Right. That's crazy at the time to think, with all the World's Fair and all the people that were there.
Yeah.
We're talking, it was like millions, Like you said, if that's your motivation, to kill people and dissect and of course profit from it too, what better place, So it is weird that, on one hand you didn't get caught because of the volume, but on the other hand you can see why, because of the World's Fair at the time.
Yeah, and remember, this was a brilliant man, a very brilliant evil man who knew chemistry, who knew medical science. He had a furnace in his basement with a gas line that could raise the temperature to be sufficient to reduce bones to dust. He had acid pits in the basement. He had a glass factory in Chicago. He had a cement factory along the Chicago River. And none of those companies sold product. I think they were there to be used for Holmes's purposes in order to remove the evidence of murder so that he could claim insurance money or sell the skeletons, as was his career most of his life. That's how he paid for his tuition going to medical school, with skeletons robbing graves. So, that's what the authorities were up against during a time when hundreds of young ladies were going missing. And like I said before, the police were just overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I guess what stunned me out of the whole thing was just to read the layout of the murder castle, like what he had hidden in walls and underneath. Like, he was just talking, like the gas chambers, the chutes, the fact that he had asbestos purposely covering stuff so everything was soundproof. I mean, when I read that just gave me chills.
And I can tell you and Kevin and your listeners, we have a Hollywood artist who is actually recreating a model of the murder castle along with the basement and all the trap doors. So keep an eye on the Bloodstains Facebook page. Matter of fact, just go and click the follow button, because in the next few days, we'll be submitting to the page her pictures of the model of the actual murder castle. And I think you and your listeners are going to be astounded at the level of detail that's going into this model and what you'll get to see. And you'll get a feel about what it was really like back in 1890s Chicago.
Wow.
That reminds me, also, going back to London and the Ripper, they said that Whitechapel back then and Chicago were very similar as far as certain parts of Chicago being very similar to Whitechapel. And was there ever, did anyone ever figure out why exactly Holmes went to London for them that short period of time? Was there any...
I have my theories about that, Kevin. It's never been, conclusively established. London was the center of knowledge of the entire world at the time, and especially medical science. Holmes was fascinated with genetics. He was fascinated with longevity. He was fascinated with the business of selling, articulating skeletons and then selling them to medical schools and universities. I believe his visits to London were to meet with the experts of those subjects at the time. I think he was fascinated with the media fascination and the fear that was generated through the entire city by the first two Ripper murders. I think as part of his quote-unquote vacation, he decided to write the Dear Boss letter, and then further the frenzy that was occurring with the murder of Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride. And I can tell you this, come April in Chicago, we're going to have an event that lasts the entire weekend where we have 100 members of our audience who are going to help us prove once and for all that Dear Boss and Saucy Jack were not hoaxes. They were authentic letters written by the murder of those two ladies, that they matched, they were written by the same hand, and that they were written by H.H. Holmes. And I'm quite excited about that because I'll have enough time for the first time. When I gave my TED Talk, I had 18 minutes. When I go on shows like yours, I have 30 or 40 minutes to discuss Holmes being Jack the Ripper. But for the first time in April, I'll have the full weekend with assistance to put the evidence up on screen and then let the audience, who we will swear in as a grand jury, decide once and for all if the Jack the Ripper case has been solved finally.
I like that idea.
Wow, that sounds like it's going to be great.
Right, because
I'd like to see you both there.
Well, we do live in the Midwest. That's interesting.
If it's successful in Chicago, we're gonna try to do it in other cities.
Yeah, and that's like the best thing you could do right now, I think, because you're not gonna. I mean, like you said, it's scrutinized so much more heavy, you know, and you know, if certain suspicions are true, then it may continue to be that way. So, what can you do? Well, take it to the people. You know, take it to the people and let the people decide. And that's exactly what you're doing. That's pretty cool.
So I'm excited. I'm excited about it because, you know, obviously working with history, and they're incredible people, but they had a television show to produce, and you know they had to fit it into the time frame they had and the advertising they had to procure to make the whole thing work. This will be my first chance to, you know, stand up on a stage and present the evidence as I would back at work in California. And that's, I got to tell you, I'm very excited about it. And the list of people that are already signed up to attend are some of the best experts on Holmes and Ripper there are. And it's going to be quite an event.
So with the last couple of minutes, I kind of want to talk a little bit both about the Holmes curse and just what or just what happened after the trial. Just kind of wrap up the show in a sense. So he escaped, right? And from that point until his death, what do we know about it?
Yeah, the Holmes curse wasn't an invention of my own, Kevin. That was written about by the New York Times in a newspaper article, which was featuring the fact that many of the most important members or associates of that murder trial, the judge, the jury foreman, the prosecutor, some of the witnesses, had either died or suffered terrible misfortune. And some of the reporters remembered seeing Holmes compiling a list of names while the trial was ongoing. And they assumed that it was names that Holmes was irritated or upset with. So the New York Times wrote this story. And when I read that article, I was fascinated knowing that that's the way he thought, Jennifer. He wouldn't have been thinking he could have gotten away with a murder trial. He would have been already thinking about escaping execution and then on his own, under his terms, going back to visit those men who had irritated or upset him. And that's what I believe actually happened in real life.
I agree, and I think the same thing happened from reading it. Because my first thought was, with as smart and methodical as he was and as careful as he was, yeah.
Do we know where he died? The area, generally? Is there any? Does anybody have even a hunch?
Well, I got to, Kevin. Thanks for asking me that, because now that I've proven that it wasn't Holmes in the grave, my next investigation is to go to the place where I think he actually is buried to see if we can remove his remains there and then do another DNA test. But that's quite a ways down the road. These things take permission from so many authorities, you can't believe it, and an amount of money that's breathtaking. You know, it cost us over $1 million to exhume Holmes in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's not something I can just snap my fingers over. It's something I'll do. It's like I'm going to excavate the murder castle one day. I'm going to get permission. I'm going to get the financial backing, and I'm going to have that done as well. But it takes a lot of work. It's like going on shows like yours where I get your listeners to help me maybe buy a copy of Bloodstains so that I can put that to, you know, our next steps. And why I appreciate the support that you both give me, you know, on having me guest on shows like yours.
Well, thank you for coming on.
Yes, thank you so much. This was definitely worth waiting for.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasurable interview.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. And everybody go out and buy Bloodstains.
Yeah.
It's a really good book.
Yeah, if you haven't gotten a copy of Bloodstains and you want to know what we're talking about in more detail, then you definitely need to get a copy, because once you read that book, your paradigm will shift completely. I know mine did.
Right now, when I think...
You know, and all you really have to do is just Google up Bloodstains, one word, and you'll come up with our website for the book order form. Also, some interesting new material we have on there that you might find interesting as well. And like I say, get on the Bloodstains Facebook page, follow it, because there's going to be some new material on there in the next few days, which is going to astound you.
Yeah, I know I definitely will be, that's for sure.
Well, you heard it from the man.
Yes.
So, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you on, and we'll see everybody here next week. To the believer, the evidence is overwhelming.
And to the skeptic, there will never be enough.
Thank you. God bless you. Everybody have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Good night, everyone.
Company is the best kept secret for great fashion at amazing prices. The new holiday collection has arrived, and this weekend is the Friends and Family Sale. Every single thing 50% off. From holiday party outfits that sparkle to hundreds of spectacular gifts starting at $5. They have something for everyone, including new arrivals from their exclusive celebrity brands from Eva Mendes and Gabrielle Union. Hurry and check out the best deals of the year from New York